One idea I always liked is a story arc for the Beacon days where Osbin scrambles all the different teams, and you have some odd teams, but they would result in some good stories. So, just to give one example here, maybe a team between Carden, Blake, Pyrrha, and Velvet. Pyrrha would not like this because Carden bullied John, Velvet wouldn't like this because Carden bullied her, and Blake wouldn't like this because Carden is a racist. However, there is a reason why Osborn would put such an odd team, to have these characters grow and change. Obviously, Carden would have to learn to live with two faunas, and thus hopefully become more and more tolerant towards them, because as a huntsman, he's gonna have to work with faunas at some point. Blake too has to learn that same lesson where she has to work with those who hate faunas and not just have them just stop being racist at the end of volume 1. Pyrrha has to learn how to work with somebody that's not just John that she's attached to the hips, and what better way to learn that lesson than to work with a person that is the opposite of John, Carden. And finally, Velvet would have to learn the same lesson that Blake did, but also possibly stand up to herself and be more confident, since, well, she has no choice but be that on a team with Carden. Even from a productivity perspective, like Pyrrha might try to focus more on honing her own skills because now she's on a new team. She might not have enough time for John when she was on his own team, so she might actually have a better chance fighting Cinder in the future. Who knows? Regardless of the results from such an experiment and the outcomes of it, these characters are going to grow, whether it be for better or worse, because they experienced new stuff and not just remain on the same team. In fact, I would argue in volumes 4 and 5, when Team Ruby were mostly separated, they were the best they could ever be, relatively speaking anyway, and even if it was badly executed. But still, I do stand by the statement. Despite being badly written in Volume 4 and 5, Blake was able to reconcile with her father in Volume 4, even though we thought she was an orphan prior to this season, and in Volume 5 she was able to take down the White Fang and defeat Adam. Thus is able to fulfill some of her goals of being a huntress to help humans and fauna's relationship. Yang was able to meet her mother finally, and yes, she never learned anything, and in fact that entire arc is bad, but still, by the end she learned that she needed to get over her mom. Weiss became finally free from her father's control over her, even though, technically speaking, she did do that when she chose to go to Beacon when the series started, but still, she also learned how to summon, so she got more combat improvement. And when it comes to Ruby, she didn't really learn anything. She just fell in love with a boy, and, well, it's Ruby, she never learns. Still, 3 out of Team Ruby actually being better when they are apart, visiting new places, forming new relationships with people is, in my opinion, much better than just being in Team Ruby, because when they came back together, all of this development just went away. Well, it's not that it went away as much as they just really became worse versions of themselves. Ever since Weiss came back to Team Ruby, she has not done a single thing to establish herself as herself, to actually find her way. What does she want to do now that she's not the heiress of the Shnidas company? Like, what is her goal in life? She goes back to Atlas despite her having the resolve of running away, but she comes back. They give the illusion that her being part of Team Ruby will develop her to be stronger in Volume 7, but nothing is done with it. Even when she takes down her father, it's not because of her own self, it's because her mom just happens to have the information. In fact, I think it would have made more sense if Willow was the one to rat over her husband, not Weiss. Anyway, since then, nothing happened with Weiss, aside from apparently having regrets over what happened to Mantle and Atlas, which is barely addressed in Volume 9, and now she has the hots for John. Now, compare this to the hypothetical scenario of Weiss actually finding Winter, as Klein told her at the end of Volume 4. What would be her own adventures? What would be her self-growth? Maybe she would have discovered herself through joining the military like Winter, or maybe she would have done something else, continuing her journey on self-discovery. Like, imagine if Weiss went to Menagerie on this journey and she interacts with Faunus, the White Fang, Ilya, somebody that her own company directly affected in her life. What could have been an interesting story to grow Weiss and develop her into someone who's much closer to her grandfather through her interactions with Morphanos, trying to help them and befriend them and try to maybe right the wrongs that her family did, is reduced to a single scene in Volume 7 where Weiss apologizes to Blake about her family killing Ilya's parents, even though Ilya was in the same room as Weiss in Volume 5 and Volume 6. Now, by this point, before we move on to Blake and Yang, I hope you understand how Weiss being so intermingled with Team Ruby, going wherever they want, has robbed her from any sort of growth as a character and any sort of independence she could have had. Personally, I think by the end of Volume 6, Weiss refuses to go to Atlas because it brings her a lot of misery and pain being in that place. She doesn't like her family and it's just a bad time for her, so she instead goes to Vakuo to help fight Salem and possibly even deliver the information she knows about Salem to Theodore, the headmaster of the Shade Academy there. They could pair Weiss with Team Coffee in the novels, and while yes, the show is called Team Ruby, I've said it multiple times, just because the title of the show has your name, that does not mean you need to be the main character. I will talk more about this later, but for now, let's talk about Yang and Blake. There really isn't that much to say about them since the end of Volume 5, when, again, they accomplished so much in Volume 4 and 5, but they haven't done much since then. To begin with Yang, while yes, it makes sense for her to have a rematch with Adam, it should have been at the end of Volume 5 when he was already defeated. Just defeating him again is just redundant, even though now he's killed forever. More importantly, however, it's been 4 seasons since the end of Volume 5 and Yang has yet to discuss Raven with anyone, including Blake and Ruby, her own sister. Sure, Volume 10 will have Raven be relevant, but that doesn't change the fact that for the past 4 years, Yang's character has been stagnant because the only thing that she had as a character, her character arc and development, which is Raven, is also stagnant. Ever since Yang came back to Team Ruby, her entire existence revolved around Blake, where it brought the worst out of Yang. In Volume 7, when Blake expresses concerns about keeping secrets, Yang's solution is, it seems good on the surface to tell Robin Hill the truth, but to also keep it a secret from Ironwood, her actual ally, the person that they know, not Robin Hill, a stranger. Thankfully, by the end of the season, they have some consequences for their actions, but they never reflect on that. Blake never once considers that Yang made her, or I should say, just convinced her to keep secrets, to be the thing that she doesn't want to be the worst version of herself. Considering how Blake talked multiple times about Adam slowly becoming worse and worse, and her relationship with him was about abuse and getting away from it, you would think Yang making Blake lie and become something that she doesn't want to be would heavily weigh on her relationship with her in Volume 8 and 9 and reconsider it. If you think that such a development is too smart for Ruby, well, they actually did this in Volume 3 with Blake and Yang, where Blake questions Yang becoming more like Adam when Yang said that she did not attack Mercury. Team Ruby literally saw Yang attack Mercury with their own eyes, and as far as Blake was concerned, she was the only one who thought that Yang was gaslighting her, like she thought Adam was gaslighting her when she was in a relationship with him. Compare this Blake to the one in Volume 7, who acts more like Adam with Sienna. Like both Sienna and Ironwood are very nice to Adam and Blake, they are very truthful, very honest and everything, but both of them plot behind their back. Blake and Adam work with the enemies of Sienna and Ironwood, resulting in the latter to apprehend Blake and Adam, obviously failing. But this behavior of Blake, where in Volume 7 she was acting like Adam, like not 100%, but has some of his traits, some of his worst traits, is because Yang made her do so. She brought the worst out of her. But unfortunately, even though this would have been a very interesting direction to take Yang and Blake's relationship in, it's never brought up. It is funny because in Volume 8 they wanted to split Yang and Blake. This would have been a good reason for them to split up, where Blake just wants space over what happened in Volume 7. But instead they just split up because the writers want to prove that Blake and Yang are separate characters. People have, complained so much about them, and they don't really succeed that much. They try to have a moment between Blake and Ruby to show how close they are, but it was really nebulous and cringe. Like, to this day, I have no idea what Blake is rambling about. It's obvious that they're trying to address the complaints where Blake and Ruby never spoke to each other in the past 8 seasons, so they're trying to address it. However, that's just admitting that Blake and Ruby don't actually belong on the same team. A better idea, in my opinion, would have been to have Willow and Whitley talk with Blake, where Blake tries to convince them to help them with Atlas and Mantle. I think that would have been a good use of her character as a White Fang member as well as a Faunus and not just platitudes. Unfortunately, what happened in Volume 8 with Blake is that they wanted to write her first as part of Team Ruby and then as Blake Belladonna, not as Blake Belladonna who is part of Team Ruby, thus resulting in the cringy Ruby scene. Anyway, moving on to Yang's side, really, they have not done anything with her character. Many people praise her talk with Ren because it is well shot. I say, what does Yang have to do with this? If you replace Yang's character and her dialogue with John, which I think would have been the best fit here, or with Nora, or with Ruby, or with Weiss, or with Blake, or with Crow, or anyone else, nothing special about Yang stands out here that says Yang needs to be here and not someone else. Still, I do applaud them trying to do something different with Yang that's not related to Team Ruby, but unfortunately all of this is undone later when John thinks the best of Yang, thinking, hey, you might be worried about your sister, about Ruby, not about Ruby as her team member, only for Yang to actually worry about Blake, which just makes things so much worse. See, if Yang brings the worst out of Blake by making her behave like Adam, then Blake brings the worst out of Yang by making her behave like Raven. Yes, it is true, when Ruby had some doubts over, the whole thing with her mother and the Hound, Yang did talk with her on a one-on-one talk. But again, this was one-on-one. When Blake Belladonna is involved in the same scene and her relationship with Yang is on stake, Yang takes Blake's side even when her sister is having a mental breakdown where Yang never notices. Now, this isn't really a problem specifically just with Yang, even though she is her sister and lived the most with Ruby where she should notice, but it is something to take in mind here, as we will talk about Volume 9 as a whole. So in Volume 9, the whole shtick is that Ruby has depression and no one notices her. You know what, sure, I'll bite even though it is obvious, but again, we'll play along. Once Blake, Yang, and Weiss, as well as John, notice this, it is too late, so they promise themselves to do better. In the same episode, a few minutes later, when they have the chance to prove that they can do better, they stand there and do nothing. The scene itself is 20 full seconds from when they notice Ruby to when she drinks the poison and dies, and again, they just stand there, do nothing. Nothing prevents them from shouting Ruby's name or do something. They just stand there. Later, when Ruby is revived, she got over her depression, meaning that whatever promise Weiss, Blake, and Yang made themselves to help Ruby the next time doesn't mean anything. There is no next time. There are no demons of depression and self-harm that Ruby is going through for them to battle. Maybe it will be referenced at best in Volume 10, but just like with Yang and her arm and Blake, it will be platitudes at best. It doesn't have actual substance. In fact, all of this reminds me so much of Blake and Yang in volume 3 to 6. Blake left Yang to deal with herself with PTSD and her new arm. By the time that Blake met Yang again, those issues were resolved. There was a reference to Yang's PTSD, arm, and Blake leaving her in volume 6, but that is not actually dealing with those issues that Yang has. Those are just platitudes. Anyway, fast forward to the end of volume 6, where Blake promises Yang to not leave her ever again. But the problem is, she can never actually prove that. Maybe it's the fight that Blake can have with Adam, where Blake doesn't run away, she instead fights Adam. And last time, she didn't run away though. Like, Blake actually stood her ground to fight Adam. The only reason that she retreated is because she was injured, as well as Yang. Therefore, when Blake says that she's not going to leave or run away from Yang again, she's referring to when Yang had PTSD and had to deal with her arm. But here is the thing, Yang is over those problems. How is Blake ever going to actually fulfill on that promise that she makes to Yang? Blake only accepted Yang back again into her life when Yang was whole. Just like when Ruby accepted Yang only when she was whole. She was not with her sister when she needed her the most. And now in volume 9, when Ruby is done with her depression and suicide, what is the point of trying to be better? There are two problems with this. People have to wait until volume 10 to know whether or not Ruby has depression. Just think about that for a second. And the other problem is, just like with Yang and Blake, where they try to do the whole thing with the arm and whatnot at the beginning, it's just platitudes. The time for Blake, Weiss, and Yang to prove that they can help Ruby with her depression should have been in volume 9, where Ruby comes back but with her depression, still having those very dark thoughts about ending herself. However, that did not happen. All of it is just gone. Maybe it will be referenced now and then, but it doesn't matter anymore, because again, the lowest part of Ruby's life, just like with Yang, is gone. And now let's discuss the entire point of this video. Team Ruby should break up. I already talked about what I think should happen to Weiss, where she should just leave Team Ruby at the end of volume 6 because, like, she doesn't want to go to Atlas. I think it's just better for her character, especially when she doesn't do anything of significance there. For Blake, however, I think she should have stayed with her parents and, the rest of the White Fang and the Faunus at the beginning of volume 6 and not go with Team Ruby. Blake's entire motivation since the beginning of the series up until the end of volume 5 was to help Faunus and humans live together. And now when that dream is about to happen, it's really odd for her to leave. She is the one who defeated Adam. She's the one who led the efforts against the corruption of the White Fang. She's an icon for the Faunus, and she just straight up leaves to join Ruby because the show is called Ruby, and because of that you need to actually force Blake Belladonna into the story when she's not needed. You know what, sure, by all means, we'll follow this logic even though it makes the characters nothing more than walking rotten zombies by this point. What I would do, at least in volume 9, is to have Blake and Yang break up. I won't repeat myself again, but as I said, Blake brings the worst out of Yang, making her act like Raven, while Yang brings the worst out of Blake, making her act like Yang. Where I think in the smoke scene in episode 4 of volume 9, Yang should have confronted Raven while Blake confronts Adam. Both Adam and Raven congratulate Yang and Blake and are proud of them for being like them. Adam reminds Blake of how she kept secret from Ironwood, thus making her very similar to him, while Raven reminds Yang of how she's ignoring her sister Ruby even though she has depression, making her like herself. Now being confronted with their true selves, Blake and Yang begin to wonder what is the thing that made them be like Raven and Adam. They think about this more and more up until the kiss scene in episode 6. They might even kiss, by all means, maybe not as cringily through the cloud storm because that's kind of stupid, but once they kiss, they don't feel anything. They feel disgusted. not because they hate each other, but they realize that this relationship is what made them the worst versions of themselves, and we get to see Yang actually starting to care about Ruby as a result. She is her sister after all, she should be the first one to notice her, but because she was so preoccupied with her new girlfriend or her feelings for Blake, she didn't. But because Yang is outspoken, she tells Blake, Weiss, as well as John about what's happening, and all of them try to help Ruby. Ruby could still run away and try to end herself because unfortunately depression is not really easily solved with a group hug. It takes a long time, and even then, nothing is guaranteed. But having Weiss, Blake, and Yang try to help Ruby, even though they fail, is much better than just promising to help her and making platitudes. However, this small rewrite, even though I like it myself, still does not address the biggest problem with Ruby as a team. They don't need each other anymore. In Volume 4, Yang did not need anybody from Team Ruby to get over her PTSD and losing her arm. In Volume 5 and 4, with Blake, she did not need anybody from Team Ruby to defeat the White Fang or Adam. Weiss did not need anybody from Team Ruby to actually choose for herself, as we saw by the end of Volume 4. And finally, Ruby in Volume 9 in 2023 did not need anybody from Team Ruby to help her get over her depression. In fact, they made her worse. They made her the worst version of herself. And I remember everybody almost wanting Ruby to leave her team, wanting her to be on her own, because her team is just toxic, including herself. Wow, this has been a really long video. I did not expect it. Originally I was going to talk about Bumblebee and just a small rewrite for them. I would still have them break up, but I discovered that aside from it being a much smaller video, just a few minutes, there was a bigger problem with Bumblebee. It was just Team Ruby as a whole. Just again, like, I made my points, so tell me yours in the comments below. What do you think? Would you be okay if, let's say, Team Ruby split up in Volume 6 at the end, and maybe, I don't know, have at most Yang with Ruby because they're sisters and that's stretching it? Maybe get a story for Blake and Weiss in novels and so on, but in the main story they just don't really need to exist currently until we see them in Volume 10, you know? I think that would have been better. But again, that's just what I think. Tell me yours in the comments below. Anyway, this will be it from me in today's video, but until the next one, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a nice day, my friends, and goodbye.